Wednesday, the Inspector General of the Department of Justice issued his report on ATF's Operation Fast and Furious. This report is a significant milestone for the family of Border Patrol Agent Brian Terry. He was killed in a firefight with illegal aliens who were armed with illegal guns for Fast and Furious. Attorney General Holder delayed any discipline for the officials responsible for Fast and Furious until after this report was released. The time for accountability has come. There are no more excuses for inaction. The Inspector General's nonpartisan review confirmed virtually everything I heard from whistleblowers over the last year and a half. The Justice Department tried to push all the blame on the ATF and officials down in Phoenix, Arizona. But the Inspector General confirmed that senior officials in Washington ignored red flag after red flag. Senior officials in both the Justice Department and ATF knew or should have known that Operation Fast and Furious was putting guns into the hands of criminals. But they ignored the risk and failed to take steps to protect the public safety. The Inspector General also confirmed that there were major information sharing failures between law enforcement agencies. We're still going through nearly 500-page report, as well as 309 pages of new documents that the Justice Department produced late Wednesday. However, I was surprised to learn from the report that Attorney General Holder testified that he doesn't remember the conversation with me about Fast and Furious in my office January 31st, 2011. That's when I handed the first letters to the Attorney General opening up the investigation of Fast and Furious. I happen to remember that conversation. My staff told the Attorney General that day what whistleblowers had told us. Remember, whistleblowers got involved in coming to Congress because for months they were sending reports up from Phoenix to Maine Justice that selling guns illegally, or encouraging our gun dealers to sell guns illegally, wasn't a very smart thing for our Justice Department to do. And when they weren't listened to, that's why these whistleblowers started coming to this senator. Specifically at that meeting with Holder, we discussed that 2 weapons that the ATF let go in Fast and Furious were found at the murder scene of Border Patrol Agent Terry. I emphasized that I was personally bringing it to his attention, meaning the Attorney General's attention, because these were very serious and credible allegations, not just some run-of-the-mill letter that I send to departments generally. Yet even after that meeting, the department didn't take this case seriously. The Inspector General's independent report says so explicitly, quote, "We do not believe that the gravity of this allegation was met with an equally serious effort by the department to determine whether ATF and the U.S. Attorney's Office had allowed the sale of hundreds of weapons to straw purchasers," end of quote. The Justice Department claimed that its process for writing letters to Congress was sound. But its February 4th, 2000 letter to me, that response was false. Now, that letter came back only 4 or 5 days after I first handed the letter to the Attorney General. Now, that letter was false because DOJ later withdrew it and claimed it relied on bad information from the ATF and the U.S. Attorney's Office. However, the Inspector General agreed with me that the Justice Department's response was seriously flawed, not just the initial response. The Inspector General also found that the Justice Department knew its initial reply wasn't true when it reaffirmed the denial of the whistleblower allegations in May 2nd, 2000 letter to me. Instead of acknowledging that it was wrong, the department repeatedly doubled down on its denials. For example, Attorney General Holder said on multiple occasions since November 2011 that the wiretap evidence authorized by the Justice Department headquarters did not put senior leadership on notice that the ATF was walking guns. Most recently, on June the 7th of this year, the Attorney General went before the House Judiciary Committee. At this point, many members of Congress had obtained and read the affidavits, even though the Justice Department did not want us to see them. Members who reviewed them said that the affidavits contained evidence of gun walking. But Attorney General Holder testified, quote, "I've looked at these affidavits. I've looked at these summaries. There's nothing in those affidavits, as I've reviewed them, that indicates gun walking was allowed," end of quote. Well, now the Inspector General has read these same wiretap affidavits. And the Inspector General, since he's independent and he's nonpartisan, that independent nonpartisan conclusion is at odds with the quote I just gave you from the Attorney General. And that quote from the Attorney General comes from testimony before the other body. I quote from this report, quote, "The affidavits describe specific incidents that would suggest ATF was employing a strategy of not interdicting weapons or arresting known straw purchasers," end of quote. In fact, much of the Inspector General's report is redacted because those affidavits are still under seal. Chairman Issa and I asked the Justice Department months ago to move to unseal them so that the public could decide for themselves. Now the Inspector General has joined Congressman Issa and this senator and is also calling for the department to ask for the permission of the court to release the affidavits. The Justice Department should have filed that motion months ago. Unsealing the affidavits will allow the American people and the Terry family to see the whole story. The details of those affidavits show that senior officials knew or should have known about gun walking in Fast and Furious. The Inspector General independently confirmed this point, quite contrary to the Attorney General Holder's denials. Those denials by the Attorney General show either incompetence or lack of truthfulness. Congress created an explicit statutory duty for certain senior Justice Department officials to authorize all wiretap applications, not just those involved with Fast and Furious. Deputy Assistant Attorney General Jason Weinstein, who served directly under Criminal Division Head Lanny Brewer, was one of the officials who approved some of these affidavits. Senior officials like Mr. Weinstein tried to claim that they shouldn't be held accountable because they only read memos summarizing the wiretaps, not the full wiretap applications, as I think is required under law. But the Inspector General found that Justice Department officials should review more than just the cover memo. He said that under the statute, they have the responsibility to be informed, fully informed, before authorizing wiretap applications. Yet the Inspector General also found that even if the, quote, even a reader of the cover memorandum would infer from the facts that ATF agents did not take enforcement action to interdict the weapons or arrest straw purchasers, end of quote. So the memo that Mr. Weinstein admits he did read indicated that ATF had walked guns according to the Inspector General. Back in September of last year, the Attorney General Holder said at a press conference, quote, "The notion that somehow or other this thing reaches the upper levels of the Justice Department is something that I don't think is supported by the facts," end of quote. Now, maybe the Attorney General doesn't think someone who reports directly to the head of the criminal division is a senior official, but this senator does. As a result of the Inspector General's findings, Deputy Assistant Attorney General Weinstein has resigned. Mr. Weinstein should be held accountable, but he shouldn't take the fall for more senior officials who are also culpable. Mr. Weinstein reported directly to Assistant Attorney General Lanny Breuer. When the Justice Department sent its letter to me denying ATF ever walked guns, Breuer knew otherwise. He knew in 2010 about gun walking in another case, Operation Wide Seaver. That was long before the allegations in Fast and Furious, yet he waited 9 months before emails about Wide Receiver were about to be produced to Congress before he publicly apologized for not doing more about gun walking in the previous gun walking Wide Receiver. I asked Breuer whether he had seen the draft of the February 4th false letter to me. Breuer testified, quote, "I cannot say for sure whether I saw a draft of the letter that was sent to you," end of quote. Now, I'm going to explain now why that was false statement that he made to me. A month after Brewer's testimony, the Justice Department released more documents showing that Breuer was sent 5 drafts of the letter before it was sent to me. He forwarded 3 of them to his personal email account. Breuer still maintained in written responses that it was highly unlikely and highly unlikely is in quotes, he had read the letter because he was in Mexico when it was sent. On this matter, the Inspector General report contained a significant factual error. And by the way, there aren't many errors in this Inspector General's report. I compliment him for a very good job that he did. The report read about whether Breuer knew anything about this letter or not. Quote, the OIG found no email messages from Breuer in which he proposed edits, commented on the drafts, or otherwise indicated he had read them. Now, that statement of the Inspector General is not true. In response to one of the drafts that Breuer received, he commented that to Weinstein that it was, quote unquote, great work. That may not be a proposed edit, but it certainly is a comment. Thus, Brewer's statement to Congress is simply not credible. Emails show that Breuer was very engaged in the process, asking for and receiving updates from Weinstein at every stage of the drafting of that letter of February 4th, 2011, that 8 or 9 months later they withdrew because it just was false. Emails show that Breuer was very engaged in the process, asking for and receiving updates from Weinstein at every stage of the drafting. Breuer and Weinstein sent multiple emails to each other on the matter each day, with Breuer asking after a quiet period, quote, "Jason, let me know what's happening with this," end of quote. So quite obviously, he was involved before the letter was ever sent to me. Now, rather than holding him accountable for this evidence, the Inspector General report gives him a pass. Worse, new emails produced Wednesday show that Brewer was in the weeds about his deputy, Jason Weinstein, coming to brief Senate Judiciary Committee staff a week after the Justice Department's false letter was sent to me. So this is on February the 13th, 2011. Brewer sent an email about such details as what specific questions my staff asked of Weinstein at this briefing. Brewer wrote, quote, "The goal, and by all accounts it seems to have worked, was to communicate that ATF's work in the Arizona case and others like it reflected sound judgment and investigative work," end of quote. It is clear that Brewer was in the weeds enough to know that the Justice Department was communicating to me was undermined by the gun walking he knew about in wide receiver. He should have come forward in February 2011 and told Congress that he knew ATF had, in fact, walked guns. His failure to do so, coupled with his attempt to mislead Congress, are why I have called for him to resign or be fired, and I made that request last fall on the floor of this Senate. Now, Attorney General has been saying for months that he would hold off on any personnel action until the Inspector General's report was released. We've been hearing that for almost a year. Let the Inspector General finish his work and then we'll decide what to do. So, Mr. Attorney General, it's time to hold people accountable. I'd like to close with language from a statement that the family of Border Patrol Agent Brian Terry issued, and that's the person where two guns that were walked were found at his murder scene. So, from the family of Brian Terry, quote, "The department's failures chronicled in the report had deadly and tragic consequences for hundreds of innocent American and Mexican victims of violent crime." Continuing to quote, "And our son, friend, relative, and hero, Brian Terry, is dead. Questions and concerns should have been raised before the weapons purchased in this failed government sting wound up in the hands of drug dealers and killers, including those who killed Brian. The focus today should not be on political spin," the Terry family says. I want to say that again. The focus today should not be on political spin control, nor on praise for the Department of Justice supervisors who chose to resign in light of the report's findings, but rather on the gross negligence of the department documented in the report and the tragic consequences of that negligence. End of quote. I yield the floor.